least for those that are being hospitalized and very sick.
Is that type of vitamin D? It's less steps in conversion to the active form, right? I think it doesn't need the liver to be converted because it's already. I think it just has one step in the liver.
That's correct.
Okay.
So the way I remember this, it's kind of crazy, but the 25-hydroxy vitamin D, I remember that's the liver one because 2 + 5 is 7, and there's 7 lobes to the liver. That might not make sense to people, but but the 1-hydroxy is really the last step. It's the one that puts the finishing touches on it. The kidney is where this happens for calcium metabolism. But interestingly, we're finding out that white blood cells have that ability to hydroxylate at the 1 position as well. And so white blood cells, which are, of course, a key component of the immune system, can take this 25-hydroxy vitamin D as the starting material and instantly convert it into the active form and use it for itself. So yeah, so 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D is the very, very active form. And you never really want to take that. That could, if you take too much of it, it could kill you just based on hypercalcemia. So taking regular vitamin D over the counter on a regular basis is the way to go, and let your body metabolize it as it needs to.
Got it. And as far as the research of vitamin D in the different parts of the immune system, it's quite widespread, isn't it? I mean, it's such a spectrum. It does a lot.
Yeah, and to talk about the receptors, you have to sort of back up a little bit and talk about what vitamin D is and what it looks like. Anybody that goes to Google and types in vitamin D chemical structure will see very quickly that the structure resembles that of very powerful hormones in the body like testosterone, estrogen, cortisol. All of these steroid hormones work by going into the nucleus of the cell in question and changing how the cell transcribes its DNA into RNA and then finally the RNA into protein. So it changes the way the cells actually behave. So vitamin D is not just this vitamin that you need to take to make your enzymes work. It actually has very complicated and very profound effects on cells.
So it's kind of a hormone-like compound.
Yes.
If we, and then this is kind of a side question that I'm just curious about. I don't know if you know much about this, but if we take a look at cortisol and vitamin D, both of them have some similar actions. They're both anti-inflammatories. They both suppress a hyper state of the immune system. But correct me if I'm wrong, but cortisol tends to just kind of put the entire immune system to sleep, doesn't it? I mean, it just inactivates the whole immune system.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's true with vitamin D.
That's not. So vitamin D tends to be an immunomodulator. I think the structure similarity between estrogen, testosterone, cortisol, vitamin D, in that they're all lipid soluble, so they can go through membranes very easily. They can go through the nuclear membrane down into the DNA where they can affect RNA transcription. But after that, there are subtleties to these hormones that specifically interact with promoters that promote certain aspects of the genes, and I think that's where they are different. So cortisol will activate certain genes. Aldosterone, which is another steroid hormone, will activate certain other genes. And of course, vitamin D does it in a different way as well.
So, so then, does the vitamin D help? Any research on the duration of viral infections, including COVID? Like, is there any research that shows it shortens the duration or intensity, or even some of the complications that can occur post-COVID?
Yeah. So we have a lot of data that shows that all of those bad things are associated with a low vitamin D level. And we have just a few studies that seem to show that supplementation, so intervention with vitamin D, does cut down the amount of time someone is positive, does cut down on the number of cytokine factors. That was the SHADE study. But we do, and that's what I'm aware of in COVID-19. But we are aware of how vitamin D can outside of COVID. So if we're talking about the flu, if we're talking about chest infection, there is a world of data there that shows that, yes, supplementation with vitamin D does cut down not only on the time, but also on the incidence of some of those infections.
Especially since the flu normally occurs in the winter or the late fall. Obviously, it sounds like a good correlation between most people are low in vitamin D, so they might be more susceptible.
Right, yeah. So for instance, there was in the British Medical Journal published in 2018 a landmark study that was published by Dr. Martineau. It was a meta-analysis of 25 randomized placebo-controlled trials that showed that people who supplement at a reasonable level, so in this case it was about 25 micrograms, which works out to be about, I believe, 400 international units, so not very much. When they supplemented on a regular basis, on a daily basis, he was able to show that over a period of time, it cut down on the amount of acute chest infections in those patients. There's an Irish study called TILDA, it's a longevity study. It showed that vitamin D supplementation cut down on acute chest infections by 50%. And then finally, there was a study in Japan where they gave vitamin D supplementation not to old people in nursing homes, but to young children in schools. And they were able to show over a winter season that there was a significant reduction in the number of positive tests for influenza.
Wow. You know, I don't understand why they have the way they test vitamin D as different units, and when they test your blood versus when they're talking about taking vitamin D, it's in international units. So,
yeah.
Why would they use those two different units? It's just so confusing to people. Like, how much do I need?
Yeah, I know, and it's the same thing with blood glucose. Like, if you were to go to the United Kingdom and talk about blood glucose, they would be talking in terms of, you know, single digits. Like, is your glucose 4, 5, 6, 7, 8? And of course, we're what? No, that's all very low. No, we're talking 80s, 90s. So the one that we're used to here in the United States is the nanograms per milliliter. That's where you'll see most of the data. But if you read, European studies, they'll talk about milligrams per liter. So it's all off. And so when you see these numbers, you've got to sort of convert them. I'm used to the nanograms per milliliter, and for that, generally speaking, the lab will tell you that 30 is the cutoff, but from the data that I've seen with COVID, I prefer to have my levels closer to 50.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Now, in actual experience, you work with people, I think in emergency room setting or just
So I'm the critical care physician, so I take care of all the patients at the ICU, and obviously sometimes I got to go down and see them in the emergency room, so I'll see them there. Sometimes I've got to go see them on the floor to see whether or not they need to come to the intensive care unit. So I'm all over the hospital.
Wow. So from your experience, just with observing vitamin D in any type of changes with patients you've seen, not even looking at studies, what are you seeing?
Yeah, personally, early on we started checking vitamin D levels, and I would say 90% of the people that were coming in for COVID-19 that were severe enough to need to go on oxygen, they were all deficient. So we're talking less than 30. I could count on one hand throughout the entire year the number of patients that I saw coming in with normal vitamin D levels, but coming in requiring oxygen. So it does happen. It's not a fail-safe. It's not, you don't become COVID-proof, but it certainly shifts, I believe, the balance.
Absolutely. What's your thought on, is it possible to get your vitamin D through food?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's there are certain foods, certain meats, egg yolks, mushrooms. It's possible. I would say that the majority of us get vitamin D from the sun. That's where the majority of vitamin D is made, especially if you're young, if you happen to have lighter skin, and if you're outside, that's where you're going to get the majority of your vitamin D.
Right. But of course, the majority of the population has, they're overweight, and they have.
Yeah.
If I don't go out in the sun much, even kids now, they're not getting out there. So unless they're probably eating fatty fish.
Yeah.
Рассветы смотрим компьютерных игр только, да.
Some of the recommendations by certain groups will say that you need about 600 or 1,500 IUs.
Yeah.
You think that's going to change, since I think we need a little bit more than that?
Here's the problem. All of the research really before 2018 was involved with calcium metabolism. So we know very well how much vitamin D we need as an absolute minimum to make sure that our calcium metabolism is working just fine. The problem is that we're not talking about calcium metabolism here. We're talking about immune health. And so it's kind of like saying that you need so much flour to make muffins and assuming that that's how much flour you need to make any bread product, right? It's different. So what you need for calcium metabolism may be different than what you need for good immune health.
Exactly. So what about insulin resistance and vitamin D absorption? as it relates to maybe metabolic syndrome. The need goes up, obviously. That's probably one thing to look at as far as if someone has insulin resistance, they're overweight, and they have maybe darker skin. What type of dosage would you recommend for people? I know there's you have the perfect person who's healthy and they have no other issues. They probably need a certain amount, but I mean, there's becoming a problem with the barriers of absorption. You have people with gut problems and
so all of that. So the biggest thing, three big things that will increase your need for supplementation is number one, age. As we get older, our skin is less efficient at making vitamin D. Of course, we make vitamin D when our skin is hit with ultraviolet B radiation. And because of the nature of ultraviolet radiation, that typically happens between the hours of 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. So the sun's got to be pretty high in the sky because ultraviolet doesn't go through the atmosphere very well. So that's age. That's number one. Number two is skin color. So obviously the more melanin you have in between the outside of the skin and the dermis, which is where vitamin D is made, then it's going to take a little bit more time for that to happen. And then finally, three, like you just mentioned, obesity. There are some studies that have shown, at least from an oral supplementation standard, that if your BMI, let's say the reference is a BMI between 20 and 25, that's normal weight. If your BMI is between 25 and 30, the studies have shown that you need to take, on average, 1.5 times the supplementation dose to get the same increase in vitamin D that somebody in the BMI of 20 to 25 would. And if your BMI is 30 or more, so if you're actually obese clinically, it's up to 3 times the amount of vitamin D that you would need to take to be able to increase your dose. So just to sort of back off a little bit there, generally speaking, let's say you were taking a low level of vitamin D. If you were to take 1,000 international units of vitamin D, you could expect your levels to go up by about 4 or 5 points. If you were taking no supplementation at all. If you were already taking supplementation and you were to say increase the amount of supplementation you were taking by 1,000, you would not go up by the same 4 points. You would go up by maybe only a point. So there's these things. It's non-linear. The more vitamin D you take, the more you have to take for it to go up. And that's why it's very difficult to really overdose on vitamin D. It's probably one of the most difficult fat-soluble vitamins to overdose on. It can happen. You've got to be careful. You don't want to be taking too much, but it's difficult to overdose on.
Let's say you take someone with metabolic syndrome, they're overweight, they're older. Would you think that 10,000 IUs would be excessive, or would that be reasonable?
I think it could be reasonable. Let me tell you what the official endocrinology societies say. And they're pretty conservative, as you can imagine. They say that if somebody is at risk for vitamin D deficiency, just like the person you mentioned, they say it's safe to take up to about 4,000 international units on a daily basis without having physician or healthcare provider supervision. In other words, getting your levels checked. It's pretty unlikely that you're going to run into vitamin D toxicity taking 4,000 international units a day. Now, if you're taking 10,000, I've never seen anybody with vitamin D excess taking 10,000 units a day. I think you probably would be running afoul if you hit 50,000 a day. But I would stick with the official recommendations of 4,000. Any more than 4,000, you probably should be getting levels checked and making sure.
Now, as far as the complications or the toxicity of vitamin D, let's say someone was, because there's several studies that I was looking at that some people were taking like 200,000 or 300,000 over months. So the risk of getting hypercalcemia, right? And that obviously, you have kidney stones.
Right. So so basically increases calcium. And so this is a good point to mention, by the way. There are certain people, because of their illnesses, that have a tendency to have higher vitamin D levels in the first place. And they may not know this, but people with sarcoid, that's a autoimmune condition where your body makes something called granulomas, and they are usually very high in vitamin D. Those would be people that I would be very careful about taking supplemental vitamin D for that. But if they're taking a lot of vitamin D, like you mentioned, and they're getting, the big thing that they would be getting is lots of calcium. And so calcium, so kidney stones, gallstones, these sorts of things could be a potential complication from very high vitamin D. Just to give you an example, there was a study that was done once where they looked at 20,000 people that were supplementing with vitamin D, and they were supplementing anywhere from a very small amount to a very large amount, like you mentioned, 200,000. The author of this study was only able to find one person out of that 20,000 that actually had a diagnosis of hypervitamin D-osis, and his levels were not 50 like we want, but a few hundred. And so that was pretty significant and serious. But you can see it's also pretty rare.
Right, right. That's right, because sometimes people are nervous about taking over like 200 or 2,000 IUs. And I'm like, well,
Yeah.
actually, it's not as common as you think as far as being toxic. Now, what about magnesium deficiency and people trying to they're taking all this vitamin D, but isn't magnesium an important cofactor for vitamin D?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Magnesium is a very important cofactor in terms of calcium and magnesium metabolism. So it's very important that both of those be taken together. Calcium is what we call a double cation. It has two positive charges. Because of the metabolism in the body, it's kind of complicated. Magnesium also is a double cation, and so also should be taken with the vitamin D if possible.
Yeah, that's right. And because it's not as simple as just take some vitamin D.
Yeah.
How about if we're talking about vitamin D and like COVID patients coming in, do you
Видишь, вот я сейчас съедаю
mention about zinc,
корень
for
растения.
example, zinc and vitamin D together? Because I know there's a lot of talk about that.
Yeah, so I can tell you right now, when people come into the hospital and they're admitted, at least at the hospital that I work at, and we have
Если бы
some
я был
input into
растением,
the
я бы
protocols,
тебя ненавидел.
everybody
Да.
that comes in, it
То
gets
есть
put on
я
5,000
съем, и все, не будет больше
international units of
растений, никому
vitamin D
тоже.
orally. Everybody that
Хорошая
comes
карма.
in gets put on zinc
У меня,
right away. And then obviously there's other protocols like Decadron, which has been shown to improve mortality in those patients. But I believe that zinc is important. For those of the people out there listening that want to supplement with zinc, the one caveat that I would mention is that zinc comes in many different forms because it's a positive charged ion and it's linked with a negative charge. So you have zinc cholinate or zinc oxide. And so depending on what it's paired with, it'll label it with different amounts of milligrams. So what you want to do is look at how much elemental zinc that you're taking, and you want to make sure that you're not taking more than 40 milligrams of elemental zinc a day. That's really the maximum. If you take more than 40 milligrams of elemental zinc, you could run into a problem with copper deficiencies because copper and zinc are kind of metabolized similarly. So just make sure that you're not overdoing it on the zinc.
Now, what about if someone's taking like a chelated zinc, protein-bound zinc? That's a little bit better than elemental?
It might be in terms of absorption and easier on the stomach, so I think that's fine, but I would still go with the 40 milligrams of elemental.
Okay, great. The other question, this is like my own question I have. I don't know if anyone would have this question, and we just want to see what your thoughts are. Autoimmune diseases. You have vitamin D deficiencies in autoimmune diseases, and also the anti-inflammatory action of vitamin D for these conditions. But the question I have is, there are vitamin D receptor problems sometimes with autoimmune diseases, and I've read this somewhere where there's the certain microbes even have strategies to somehow create a blockage or inhibiting effect on the vitamin D receptor because that's their strategy to overcome your immune system. Have you heard anything about that?
I have not heard about that, about microbes basically commandeering your receptors. But let me tell you what I have heard, and this is interesting that you mentioned about autoimmune diseases and vitamin D. I can tell you that in my family, I don't personally have this, but in my family, we have a lot of Crohn's disease. Crohn's disease is a GI disease that is basically an autoimmune condition. I could name off 7 different family members, cousins and aunts and uncles that have it. My sister does not have it, but one of her children, so my nephew, had Crohn's disease when he was very young. He had it very severely. He had even anal fistulas and things of that nature. And he was sat down, talked to my brother-in-law, sat down and talked to him, and said, look, and by the way, I have permission to tell this story because he's actually blogged about this. He says, you're going to need to be on a liquid diet for a long time here if we're going to get through it. Liquid diets in pediatric pregnancies seems to work well, but one of the other important things that he did for him was he put him on a vitamin D supplement to make sure that his vitamin D levels were elevated, because his were actually on the low side, and he lives in California. Ever since he did that, he went into remission, and it's been years since any of that has come back at all. And he did that. My brother-in-law, his name is Sean Pittman, and he actually has a blog where he talks about this. He went in and researched it, not because he was interested, because he had to. One of his kids had it. And the conclusion that he came to was that vitamin D was essential if you want to modulate the immune system and prevent it from having this autoimmune response. And let's face it, in COVID-19, that's exactly what we're dealing with. We're dealing with an autoimmune response that overwhelms the immune system and causes the damage that we're seeing in the lungs. And so I believe that vitamin D can help modulate that and reduce the severity of COVID-19.
Wow. So, so you mentioned autoimmune and COVID-19. So you're talking about an autoimmune lung problem that develops from COVID-19?
Well, I'm just basically saying the cytokine storm fits under that condition of an autoimmune where the immune system is so overwhelmed. But the problem is that early on, the immune system is not strong enough because the interferon response is not taking care of the virus. And finally, when the adaptive immune system comes online 7 days later, there's this tremendous, it's kind of like the kids, the teenagers had a party at their house and the parents have just come home. That's what happens, and you know, everything goes crazy, and that's the problem with COVID-19 is the lungs fill up with fluid and you can't oxygenate them, and then you know what happens.
Absolutely. As far as the people that have autoimmune diseases, and also have you found any high correlation or seen this or heard this in like polymorphism, like a defect in their genes, especially for vitamin D?
So I have heard about some studies that have looked at polymorphisms, and it was known as epigenetics, where they look to see whether or not people with problems in their vitamin D receptors are also the people that seem to have the most severe COVID. And they did that study, and they did not find an association between the epigenetic issues of vitamin D and those that were severe in COVID-19. Now, they have done those studies with other genes, for instance, interferon, and there's a strong correlation there. People that have problems mounting interferon, either because they have antibodies against their interferon or because the genes that make the interferon are not working appropriately, it's very clear that those people tend to have severe COVID-19, no question. That was published in a very prestigious journal called Science at the very beginning of the pandemic. But we have not seen those results with vitamin D.
But as far as someone that wants to prevent COVID-19 or prevent the severity, is there any other natural things that you would recommend patients or people should be taking as far as things that can help to maybe increase their resistance or decrease their vulnerability?
Okay, so let me do a rapid fire thing of things that I think are interesting. So very quickly, there was a randomized placebo-controlled trial that was conducted in Iraq, looking at something called black cumin seeds. I think some of your audience may already know about this. This was not a small study. This was about 400 patients in this study, and it was randomized. It was open label, and they did about 1 teaspoon of cumin seeds per 50 kilograms of the patient's weight once a day, and they noticed a tremendous impact in terms of mortality, in terms of the length of stay. Black cumin seeds is a seed that comes from a flower in that area, and it's filled with thymoquinone. Thymoquinone has a long track record of being an anti-inflammatory, an antiviral, antibacterial, and so I think probably more research needs to be done. But I look at this and say, what's the risks, right? What are the risks of giving black cumin seeds? And I think they're pretty zero. And so what's there to lose? So actually, to be honest with you, I've actually asked our hospital to add it to our protocol. And we're giving it now to COVID patients who come in as a nutritional supplement. So that's one thing. The second thing that I really find fascinating, this is
Интересно, Black Cumin. Черные орешки.
research needs to be done, but I look at this and say, what's the risks, right? What are the risks of giving black cumin seeds? And I think they're
Черная ярочная, что ли? Да. Где эта штука-то? Ретранслятор точнее, это самое штучки. Кубойского. Black Currant, мы знаем, что такое. Black Cumin. Schwarzkümmel. Ну да. Fair enough. Тмин. А ты который такой вкусненький-то? Да. Боярский. Черный тмин. Давай посмотрим, что такое. Ну да. Не, иногда хочется вот травушка, муравушка что-нибудь, да? Нет, не хочется. Ну да, ну это что ли? Нет, если будешь доверять своей, понимаешь, если наркоман будет доверять своей тяге, да, если, да, но он про это тоже говорит. Я тоже про это так считаю, это тоже так, да, я понимаю. Но все равно, когда, ну не знаю, думаешь, обманка, да? Ну, по идее, да, я сегодня, ну да. Ну это есть на самом, вот это и думаю сам. Магазин, да. Да это не, ну да. Наверное, под контролем, везде держать, если того, да. Я знаю, вот это. Это что ли? Нет. Все в своем, да. Ну, все равно интересно, смотри, если ты заболел и вообще пипец, что происходит. Естественно, ты жил несовершенно какой-нибудь там, да. То есть, ну, не знаю, может, не знаю, ну умри тогда. Ладно, да, понимаю. На это надо время какое-то, наверное, да? Наверное. Не знаю, да. Ну, умрите сами, да.
pretty zero. And so what's there to lose? So actually, to be honest with you, I've actually asked our hospital to add it to our protocol, and we're giving it now to COVID patients who come in as a nutritional supplement. So that's one thing. The second thing that I really find fascinating, this has really absorbed me for the last couple of weeks, so I'm glad I was able to talk to you about this. There was a study that was done by some Scottish scientists that looked at the United States during the winter, last winter in 2020, and they noted that they correlated sun exposure to mortality in COVID-19. Now that shouldn't be a surprise. We're talking about vitamin D. But here's the kicker. The kicker was that this was
учитывая, ну, наверное, ну, да, все равно, что-то.
High enough northern latitudes in the United States. They actually drew a winter by a couple of weeks, so I'm glad I was able to talk to you about this. There was a study that was done by some Scottish scientists that looked at the United States during the winter, last winter in 2020, and they noted that they correlated sun exposure to mortality in COVID-19. Now that shouldn't be a surprise. We're talking about vitamin D, but here's the kicker. The kicker was that this was at high enough northern latitudes in the United States. They actually drew a line at the 35th parallel and excluded everybody south of that because they knew that sun exposure south of the 35th parallel could actually improve their vitamin D levels. So they specifically looked at people who were getting sunlight who could never get enough sunlight to make enough vitamin D to make a difference in COVID-19. And you know what they found? They found that sunlight still improved outcomes in COVID-19, leading them to conclude that there is something in sunlight other than vitamin D production that is leading to better outcomes. Now, they looked at not only the United States, they looked at England and specifically Italy, and they found exactly the same results. Now, here's something, Dr. Berg, that I think is really interesting, and I noticed that you actually touched on this in one of your earlier videos, is that what is in light? we know that the majority of the energy coming from the sun is actually in the infrared spectrum. It's ultraviolet on the other end of the spectrum that makes vitamin D. We are just now starting to understand the importance of infrared radiation, not only in terms of healing and wounds and things of that nature, but new research is showing that infrared radiation can penetrate deeper into the skin and can actually stimulate mitochondria to make melatonin in the mitochondria. Melatonin is a very powerful antioxidant and is one that people believe may actually be beneficial in not only COVID-19 but in many different diseases.
That is fascinating. You have to give me that.
Ну да.
Yeah.
Those papers. That is interesting because I did a video on that, so I was wondering what other things, but that's fascinating. That is really interesting. So I really appreciate you coming on. I don't want to keep you too long, and for those of you, I would highly recommend. I'm going to put a link down below Dr. Schwelt's YouTube channel, and I think also MedPram as well, because you definitely need to subscribe. This doc has so much great data, and I like that you're able to explain it very clearly so people can understand. I really appreciate that. So thank you so much for your time and your valuable information.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Berg. It's a privilege to be on.
Absolutely.
Большинство людей не любят продавать. Они не любят делать то, что каждый день все равно делать приходится. Большое количество продавцов, они боятся предложить сделку, несмотря на то, что знают, что сделка это то, что приносит деньги. А в чем проблема? Дело в навыке. Да. Если у вас нет навыка, то вы в принципе будете бояться всего на свете. Без разницы. Ездить по гололеду, кататься на серфе, выступать публично, драться в рукопашную, с тещей спорить. Так получилось. Да. Разумеется, у кого-то есть способность